Okay, again, welcome to all that are here. We're going to be talking today about the U.S. electricity system. Hopefully, that's what you're here to learn about. What we're considering are how does it work and really where are we going with it. My name is Lucas Ford. I am a PhD student in the Department of Civil Engineering here at NC State. I study power systems and water systems, in particular large-scale infrastructure.
Hey everyone, my name is Aditya Keskar. I'm a fourth year PhD candidate in the Civil Engineering Department. I study both building energy systems and I also study solar water pump deployment back home in India. So here's the plan for today's webinar as Lucas was talking about. Some of the motivating questions behind today's webinar are: what are the resources currently supplying the US electricity system? How is it operated? What are the challenges we face currently? And where are we headed in our efforts to decarbonize our energy system? So just a few caveats before we get started. So this webinar is just meant to be a crash course and not an in-depth review on the working of the grid. As such, math and engineering concepts will be kept very minimal. And wherever we introduce energy units or we introduce a number, we try to provide you guys context on how you can interpret those numbers and how you can keep them in mind. I think in my email I mentioned if you want to keep a pen or paper at hand just to jot down some numbers, that works too. If you want to just sit and listen along, that's fine too. So the first thing we'll be talking about today is US national energy consumption. So often people forget that energy is not just the electricity you consume, but energy is also the energy you use to drive a car, the energy that's used for manufacturing, the energy used in agriculture. So energy means a lot of different things. So to quantify the US national energy consumption, we need an appropriate unit that we're able to interpret very easily. And that unit is called a quad. So a quad is short for quadrillion BTUs, and it's approximately equal to the energy in 36 million tons of coal. So a quad is one quad means a lot of energy because it's 36 million tons of coal. And a good way to visualize this is if you filled the entire Empire State Building with coal, 22 of those buildings would be one quad of energy. So 22 Empire State Buildings worth of coal is one quad of energy. So when it comes to US national energy consumption, the United States consumes around 93 quads of energy. So that's roughly 2,000 Empire State Buildings filled with coal. This 93 quads includes everything: the amount of energy you need to generate electricity, the amount of energy you need for your transportation needs, and the amount of energy that industrial processes need. So the entire US energy consumption is 93 quads.
So as Adi was just saying, 93 quads, it's a lot of energy. The real question is where are we getting that energy from? What primary sources are we using for that energy? The answer in the U.S. is we get about 70% of it from coal plants, 70 to 80% from, not coal plants, but fossil plants. So that is petroleum, natural gas, and coal. We get about 13% of that from renewable electricity, and then nuclear power comes in and plays in around 9%. So that makes up the total 93 quads that Adi mentioned. From that 93, we send around 36 quads to the electric power sector to generate electricity. This electricity is then dispersed mostly over the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors for end use. A couple things to note here is that though petroleum makes up a large fraction of our total energy consumption, most of that goes to transportation or industrial uses. Very little petroleum goes into electric power generation. Another thing is that electric power generation outside of petroleum has a pretty diverse mix. We get large proportions from renewable, nuclear, coal, and natural gas, so it's rather varied. A good rule of thumb when you're thinking about how much energy each sector consumes, if you group the residential and commercial sectors, then you can, as sort of like buildings, you can think of the three sectors as buildings, industrial, and transportation. And a rule of thumb is you can say each of those consumes around a third of the total U.S. electricity, or energy, sorry. That's not exactly correct, but it is reasonably accurate.
So now that we've spoken about sort of national energy consumption in terms of quads, let's zoom into the power plant level and introduce two more units. So if you look at the power plant in the picture, so the two questions that you would ask when you look at a power plant is how much electricity does it produce throughout the year, and what is the maximum power the power plant can produce at a given time. So for the first question, the unit that's used at the power plant level is megawatt hours. And that's the unit we'll be consistently using across this presentation. So megawatt hour quantifies the amount of electricity production, and it measures energy. And the second unit is megawatts. So you remove the hour from megawatt hours and you get megawatts. And this gives you the rate of electricity production, and it measures power. So let's first look at megawatts. So megawatts, that defines the rated capacity of your generation on the grid. So the total installed capacity in the United States today is around 1.1 million megawatts. So if you see the map on the slide, all these are the US power plants that were plotted by Dr. Emily Grubert using EIA data. And all the power plants together are rated at 1.1 million megawatts. The second unit is an energy unit, so that's megawatt hours. So the United States electricity consumption is around 3,700 million megawatt hours a year. A good way to think about a megawatt hour is that average electricity consumption on a monthly basis for an average American household is a little less than 1 megawatt hour. So you in your home, an average household consumes a little less than 1 megawatt hour every month. So the electricity consumption is 3,700 million megawatt hours, and if we tie it back to the first unit we introduced, it's roughly 13 quads a year. And the quads actually, it gives you a good sense of why quads is a good unit for national energy consumption, because it's more digestible. It's a smaller number to think of. So we want to clarify one sort of confusion that you might have. So why do we consume 36 quads of energy and generate just 13 quads? Well, that's because, so if you remember the Sankey diagram that Lucas spoke about, there was 36 quads of energy that was used by the electricity sector. And that's because we're not 100% efficient in the way we produce the electricity. So we're roughly 35% efficient, which means that roughly 2/3 of the energy that you input to the grid is lost as waste heat. And 1/3 of that, which is around 13 quads, is consumed, goes to the demand, which is, as Lucas was mentioning, a third transportation, which goes to different buildings, transportation, and industry.
So the next logical question is, where do we get our electricity from? What are we generating this electrical power with? In the U.S., the answer is largely natural gas. You can see here, we get around, and this is in 2020, we get around 16,000 million megawatt hours of natural gas generation. And then moving up the plot, we decrease slightly. Another unit that Adi mentioned was capacity. So how much capacity do we have installed to actually generate these? If you look here, one interesting thing to point out is that while coal, which is the red bars on both plots, and nuclear, which is the yellow bars, generate around the same amount of electricity, nuclear has far less installed capacity than coal. The reason that nuclear can do this is because it runs almost all the time, around 93% of the time actually, as compared to coal, which only runs around 41% of the time. If we look at some pretty prevalent renewable resources in solar and wind here, they're only going to operate around 22% of the time for solar and around 33% of the time for wind. And that's largely due to the availability. The sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So that limits how often that they can run. Speaking of these renewable resources, what I have plotted here is the U.S. renewable generation since 1950. You can see that for the most part, we've got a lot of power from hydroelectric generation. So that's dams, releasing water to generate electricity. More recently, especially since 2010, we have had large growths in solar and wind generation. So solar since 2010 has added around 9,000 megawatt hours per year. And similarly, wind is at around 24,000 megawatt hours per year, again, since 2010. So given these trends, the question we pose to you is, which states do you think generate the most solar and wind in 2020? So we'll give you a little bit of time to answer this. You can put what you think in the chat, and then we'll come back and go over the data on which states actually generate the most. And you don't have to know, per se. Guessing is totally fine. We just want you to start thinking about where these resources may be distributed and which states are contributing the most to this this generation growth, I'm sorry. So we've got some really good answers in the chat, actually. So obviously, a lot of people said California for solar. That seems to be in the news all the time. It's something that we often hear. And then Texas is in there pretty often as well. So what we have here is, on the far left side, we've actually got the coal generation as sort of a comparison number. And so if we look at the top state for solar and wind, as most of you said in the chat, California tops it for solar and Texas actually tops it for wind. Additionally, a lot of people said North Carolina, and North Carolina comes in second for solar generation in 2020, whereas Oklahoma comes in second for wind. Now the drop-offs from 1 to 2 are pretty steep, but nonetheless, these are who come in first and second. Rounding out the top 5, you have states that are plentiful in sunshine for the solar, and then you have rather windy states in the middle of the country who are generating the most wind power. So that's kind of the distribution of these resources that we see. The solar resources are going to be more in the southern part of the country, especially in the southwest. And then the wind resources are going to be much more up the middle of the country. So we've talked about generation. We said we were going to talk about the power grid, and now we want to talk about how it actually operates. So before we do that, we want to get into what the power grid actually is. So in the U.S., our electrical grid has been called the greatest invention in human history. It's been called the world's largest machine. And while those are nice superlatives to talk about, what it actually ends up being is 3 synchronized interconnects. And when I say synchronized, what I mean is things that happen in one interconnect, anywhere in it, have an effect on things that happen in that same interconnect somewhere else. So for example, generation decisions that happen in Florida could potentially impact generation decisions that happen in Tennessee or Kentucky, for example. These interconnects can largely share power amongst each other. So within the Eastern Interconnect, you can share power, and within the Western, you can share power, but it's hard to actually share power between them because the infrastructure isn't there. So most of you will probably remember early this year when Texas had the electricity system failures that they were going through. Part of the reason, not all of it, but some of the reason that they had those is because, as you see, they have a pretty isolated interconnect there. It's difficult for them to get power from the eastern or the western side. And so that was, again, part of the reason that they had to shed load and so many blackouts happened. So what happens whenever you go to cut on your light switch or turn on your computer or your oven? Basically, when you want electricity at your house, how does that eventually get there? So we've talked about generation, and essentially if you flip on a light switch, some plant, whether it's a coal plant, a natural gas plant, wind, is either going to be generating power or going to start generating power for you to use that. From the generation plants, the power goes out onto what we call the transmission system. This is a grid built of high voltage lines that is really designed to move power relatively long distances with minimal power losses. So an analogous system here that you can think of is you can think of the transmission system as our highway system. You're going to go long distances, whereas if we get to the distribution system, which is what connects the transmission system to your home, these are lower voltage power lines that are more designed to take the power and distribute it to where it's actually going to be used. So the electricity goes into substations, the voltage is dropped, and then it's sent out over distribution lines to homes and businesses and any end-use consumer. And continuing with the previous analogy, you can think of this as the roads you use to get from the highway to your house. It's worth noting here that most of the time whenever you have a power outage, it's usually due to a failure in the distribution system. These can come from downed trees, high winds, or squirrels or birds getting into substations and shorting systems out. So often power failures occur at the distribution level, and so the next time you have a power outage at your house, that's the system that probably failed.
Thanks, Lucas. So now that we've come to the three different facets of electricity, that's generation, transmission, and distribution, let's look at the two models that are used in terms of markets as to how electricity gets to us as consumers. So the first model involves what we call a vertically integrated utility. So in vertically integrated utilities, the utility owns the generation, transmission, and distribution. And then the utility transfers that electricity to customers. So for example, here in North Carolina, the generation is owned by Duke, the transmission is owned by Duke, and the distribution, no surprises there, is also owned by Duke. And on the consumer side, it's us or NC State that are the customers of Duke. So Duke owns all three facets of electricity in a vertically integrated utility model. Now, to regulate this model, you have Public Service Commission. So in North Carolina, you have the North Carolina Utilities Commission that regulates Duke, that regulates its ability to charge customers on how much on the investments they make on the generation side, on the transmission side, on upgrading the grid. And it also ensures that customers are not cheated by Duke. So because of this regulation, this model is often called a regulated market in terms of electricity operation. Just a quick side, the reason we included NC State there is because NC State has a bit of a hybrid structure where we generate some of our own electricity and we purchase the rest from Duke. For example, last year, 49% of the energy that was consumed on campus was generated on campus, and 51% was purchased from Duke. That fact was brought to you by our awesome energy management team at Facilities and Operation. So I think to have a deeper appreciation for how we got here and how the electricity system got here, we won't take a deep dive into the history of utilities today, but we want to give you guys sort of just a highlight, just a rough timeline of how utilities evolved to the way they are today. So before the 1970s, utilities were considered as monopsonies. So a monopsony involves you have one buyer and you have one seller. And it's really in 1978 when utilities had to rethink the structure. With the introduction of the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, you'll hear this called PURPA. So whenever you hear an energy nerd talk about PURPA, this is the act they're talking about. So this act was passed under President Jimmy Carter's administration, and it required utilities to purchase power from qualifying facilities. So this was the first time that utilities had to purchase power from independent producers rather than their own generators. And then in the 1980s, you had economists argue that utilities really have no incentives to operate or invest efficiently and emphasize the need to deregulate utilities, which led to the 1990s where the deregulation era began and you had wholesale markets that were formed in the United States, and utilities had to also divest some of their assets. But then in 2001, you had the infamous California energy crisis happen where wholesale electricity prices shot through the roof. And one of the reasons for that crisis was has been proposed to be market manipulation by the players involved. And this really stymied the growth of markets across the United States. A book recommendation we have for you, if you're interested in sort of the history of the grid and how we got here, is The Grid by Dr. Gretchen Barkay, who's an anthropologist who's written an excellent book on the history of the electrical grid. So the second model when it comes to electricity operation is deregulated markets. So if you see the map on your screen, you have independent system operators across the country which span multiple states that are non-profit organizations that operate the transmission system and also foster competition amongst electricity generation. So two ones I can point to is the one in purple, which is PJM, which spans Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland in the Northeast. And you also have the California Independent System Operator out in the West. Since this spans multiple states, it's regulated on the federal level by the Federal Electricity Regulatory Commission.
So we've talked about the system, we've talked about generation, we've talked about different types of markets. So now we want to ask you another question. If it was your job to operate an electricity system, what would you care about? What are the considerations you would have? How would you go about doing the day-to-day businesses of operating a system like this? We'll give you a little bit of time and you can go ahead and put it in the chat, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So we have some good responses so far. If anybody else wants to add anything, please feel free to do so. Yeah, everything that people put in the chat is absolutely correct. The first thing that people typically think about is peak demand. How much do I need to serve at the maximum time during this day, during this month, during the year, over various temporal horizons, but peak demand is a term often used for that. The other thing, we've seen cost in the chat. We want to do this at the lowest cost absolutely possible, given some constraints. And then we also have to move this demand, this electricity generation, from where we're generating it from to where it's required at. And we do that over the transmission system, like we said. So we need to make sure that our transmission lines have enough capacity to do this. And then we've seen losses in the chat as well. We want to make sure that we're moving it in a way that minimizes the amount of loss on the power line. And then we don't know what's going to necessarily happen in the future. We could have things that go really badly. In that case, we need to have backup power to make sure that we can still meet demand and maintain reliability without compromising our electricity grid. And then, like we said, electricity is actually a very unique commodity. It has to be managed in real time. Whenever there's demand, there has to be supply. So operators need to have enough flexibility to match the supply and demand in real time and then also in the future. So they're thinking about different time scales from days to hours down to seconds. So all of these things go through an operator's head when they're doing this. A lot of times they're wrapped up in a mathematical model that does some sort of optimization. We're not going to get into that, but we are going to have Adi go through a little bit of an example of how you would do this on a daily basis.
So let's look at an example of California. So if you see, I spoke about the California Independent System Operator, which is one of the independent system operators out in the West. So the curve you see on your screen, that's California's generation on March 14th, 2019. So throughout the day, that's on a 24-hour time span, that's the electricity demand of the entire state of California. So let's look at how a system operator would manage this grid. So one of the things to note is resources like solar and wind, which Lucas alluded to previously, they're not controllable. So we don't control when the sun shines, we don't control when the wind blows. So the way we manage renewables on the grid right now is we just take what they produce and we manage other power plants to manage that variability. So the first thing is, the way you would meet this demand is take in all the solar and wind you have, along with the geothermal. So this leads to a very interesting phenomenon in California, which, as you recall, is the state with the highest amount of solar generation on the grid in the United States today, around 28 million megawatt hours. And it leads to a phenomenon called the duck curve. So if you see the middle of the curve, where in the middle of the day, there's a lot of excess solar generation. And you can see that's like the belly of the duck, and you have these ramps in the morning and the evening, which is like the neck of the duck. So What renewables cause on the grid today are these steep ramps in the evening. So what's happening in the evening is that when the sun sets, your solar generation goes from 100, whatever it's operating at, to zero. And simultaneously, people are going home, they're switching on their lights. So your demand is increasing while a substantial generation that you have on your grid is decreasing all of a sudden. So these ramps are incredibly difficult periods of grid operation for system operators because they need to quickly change the power consumption of units that are online to manage this ramp, and also sometimes bring on units which are offline. And it takes some time to start a power plant. So these ramps are very stressful times if you're a grid operator. So the next resource that comes in is hydro. So hydropower plants, hydro is very good at load following services. So the hydro is able to track the hydro resource on your grid is able to track the demand really well. And the remaining generation comes from natural gas, and you also have imports. The orange line you see right at the bottom is nuclear. So as Lucas mentioned, nuclear operates roughly 93% of the time. So it's able to provide that steady, clean form generation that the grid needs. So if you think about it, one thing I will say as someone who's been researching in this field, a lot of research has gone into how to handle the variability of renewables. So over the past decade, there's been some excellent research across the world that's come into how we can integrate more renewable energy into the grid. So this is a challenge for system operators, especially if you look at the morning and evening ramps I mentioned. So let's look at some of the solutions if we want to get to a 100% clean electricity system. So the first one that all of you may have heard of is storage. So if one of the interesting phenomenon that happens in the middle of the day is if your solar resource on that day is particularly good, you can have this case of solar is over-generating. So you have to get rid of that solar, which is called curtailment. Because the system operator is not able to sort of incorporate that much solar and shift other power plants on the grid. So if you can imagine that you have storage in the middle of the day that absorbs a lot of solar that you can use later in the day when solar and wind might not be that available, storage can play a significant role in the future. And California is one of the leading states in the country to do that. In just last month, in August, they hit over 1,000 megawatts of storage on the grid. And they're integrating storage at an incredible pace in that state. The second form of solution that we have is really looking at our demand. So like I said, traditionally we like to control our generation to match the demand, but a new form of service is demand-side services, where you actually control demand to match your supply. So one example is a lot of air conditioning and thermostat programs that utilities have. So if you have buildings in the middle of the day where you could decrease the thermostat and the buildings call for more cooling, such that excess renewable energy that's there is dissipated across buildings. And this allows the system operator to integrate more renewables onto the grid. This program is called demand response services. And it's also one of the ways on the demand side that can really help us integrate more renewables. And third is just using less. So energy efficiency is one of the significant technologies that is going to get us to a decarbonized energy system. So energy efficiency can mean improving the insulation of the building, installing more efficient lighting, installing a building automation system in your building that you're able to manage building energy consumption better. So now that Lucas and I have described grid operation, let's look at where we headed. And this question really starts off with the carbon intensity of the grid, which is driving how electricity operation is changing. So if you look at this graph from Carnegie Mellon University, on the y-axis we have the US power sector carbon intensity, so that's in pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour generated. And on the x-axis you have a timeline from 2000 to 2020. So you can see that we've actually reduced the carbon intensity of the grid at a huge pace in the past 20 years. So we started off around 1,400 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, and currently we're roughly around 800 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. So how to interpret this plot? So an average natural gas power plant would roughly consume around 1,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. And a coal plant would actually not be on this plot because it consumes almost double of that, so roughly 2,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. So if we integrate solar and wind at the current pace at which we're going, we'll get to around 400 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour by 2030. And if we go to President Biden's 100% clean power plan, we expect the carbon intensity of the grid to drop to zero by 2035.
So we've talked about decarbonizing the electricity grid. The real question is how do we get there? And as we've mentioned throughout the day, there are numerous renewable resources that can be used to assist in this, and in some cases, nuclear power as well is a zero carbon at the generation source resource as well. So that part of it is not necessarily straightforward, but we've hit on those topics so far. But when we actually have a clean grid, we can use that to reduce our emissions in other sectors as well by electrifying those sectors. So we'll start with the residential and commercial sector. And if you remember, we can kind of group these into buildings. And buildings consume around 40% of our total energy in the U.S. At the moment, 43% of that is primary energy. 43% of that primary energy is fossil fuels. And then a large portion of the electricity consumed is also fossil fuel based. So these industries consume a lot of energy and mostly from fossil fuels. The real question is, where do they go? Well, those fossil fuels go to space heating, water heating, and cooking for the most part. The good news is that these have electric analogs that can be almost drop-in replacements for these. Space heating, water heating, and cooking are easily electrified, meaning that this sector, the residential and commercial sector, could go from using 70% fossil down to 20 or 10% fairly easily. Moving from the buildings in our economy, we can look at the transportation sector, which consumes around 26% of our total primary energy. So if we look at where that energy is coming from in terms of by source, 60% of it comes from gasoline, 25% of it comes from diesel, there's 14% that's really made up from jet fuel and other types of those, and other fuel types like that, and then less than 1% is actually coming from electricity. And I know driving around Raleigh sometimes it can feel like we're getting a lot more than 1% of electricity to our transportation sector, but on a national level, it's a very small amount. So we have these sources, but where do they go? 55% of that goes to light-duty vehicles you and I may drive around town. Another significant chunk, about a quarter, comes from commercial and freight trucks. We get less than 10%, but a non-negligible amount for aviation. And then all other sources, this could be military, watercraft, any other transportation uses make up the other 14%. So what does this mean? It means that there's a lot of potential for electrification within this sector. And if you look at the consumption by use, those light-duty vehicles, 55% of our consumption, really most of those miles are easily converted to electric miles because most of those are driven around town. Those cars go back to the same place every night and park in most instances. They're not doing very many long hauls. So they're really primed to be replaced by electric vehicles in the future. Why does replacing them with electric vehicles matter? Well, if you look at the grid in North Carolina and you look at which cars produce the least amount of carbon, all electric vehicles, ones that you plug in and charge and they don't have any engine in them, produce the least amount of CO2 per mile compared to a plug-in hybrid or a hybrid, which are partly powered from the grid, and then the hybrid is all gas and then uses various technologies and batteries on board. All three of these are better than gasoline, but in North Carolina, all electric is the best. If you compare that to a state like West Virginia that gets roughly 80% of their electricity from coal generation, an all-electric and a plug-in hybrid car are actually going to be worse than a traditional hybrid vehicle. But one thing to note is that across the country, these hybrid electrics or all-electric cars are better in terms of CO2 emissions than gasoline vehicles. And then finally moving to the last sector. So this is the industrial sector. Many people claim that this is the most difficult sector to actually electrify. Part of the reason for that is that it's reliant roughly about 80% on fossil fuels. These fossil fuels go to power mostly manufacturing. This is steel, cement, pharmaceuticals, pretty much anything where they're generating a product that they want to sell or that can go into another product that they're going to sell encompasses this manufacturing category here. Following manufacturing is 12% for mining, and then 7% for construction and 5% for agriculture. So there are a couple things that make this sector particularly hard to electrify. The first is that most of this energy is going to generate it's going for process heat, high temperature process heat, which is not as easy to generate with electricity as it is to generate with burning things. However, the fact that the bulk of the industrial sector is made up from manufacturing means that these buildings are in place and stationary, and they probably already have the capacity to bring in a lot of electrical power. What that means is that if there are ways to electrify things within their processes, manufacturing facilities are primed to take advantage of that. So we've talked so far about the grid, where it's going, and how it's operated. We haven't talked about what are the potential impacts that a changing climate may have on our electrical infrastructure. So if we're looking at these potential impacts, we can really break them into two categories: long-term and short-term impacts. And we can, chronic or acute, different ways to label this, but when we're talking about long-term impacts, we're talking about the reduced lifespan of electrical infrastructure, decreases in efficiency of both generation and transmission due to higher temperatures, and then potential for reduced water availability depending on your region. That limits hydropower production and can also limit thermal generation. When we get to the short-term side of things, there are extreme weather events, hurricanes and wildfires and heat waves that can damage electrical infrastructure, limit generation sources, and also take them down for extended periods of time. And then also recently we've discovered there are more compounding effects that can lead to really bad circumstances for a grid. For example, an extreme heat wave and a bad drought at the same time. These are becoming more likely to occur together, and they really can stress a power grid because the heat increases power demand for cooling, and then the drought limits the available generation capacity. So not only do we have these things that could potentially happen to the grid, but we're also planning on expanding the grid, adding more things and electrifying more things. So we're having reduced capacity, but we also need to build more capacity. So these are things that people are thinking about as they're building out the grid today.
Thanks, Lucas. So just to recap today's webinar before we end things, we spoke about where we get our electricity from in the United States. We spoke about different operation models, and then we headed to decarbonization and spoke about the different sectors and the electrification efforts that are going to lead us to a completely decarbonized energy system. So we really appreciate all of you joining us today. And here are some takeaways that we'd like to leave you with. So the first takeaway is that managing the grid is an incredibly complex job. And I hope today's presentation, if you're not familiar with the working of the grid, you go away with a deep sense of appreciation for system operators who manage this large grid. The second takeaway is that renewable resources pose new challenges to the grid that are largely manageable. Climate change, as Lucas was stating in the previous slide, poses new challenge that the grid was not designed to handle. This was a grid that was largely designed in the 20th century, and the challenges like we saw in Texas with extreme weathers, these are challenges that the grid is facing that it wasn't designed to handle. So this requires innovation and a lot of effort from energy researchers and utilities to combat. We need to rapidly decarbonize our electricity sector and electrify other fossil fuel consuming sectors. This is one of the key strategies to getting to a decarbonized energy economy. And lastly, the good news is that the technologies we need to decarbonize the grid are mature and cost effective. So thank you all so much for joining today's webinar. We have quite a bit of time for Q&A, so feel free to ask any questions you have. We've listed our contact emails on this slide. We also want to acknowledge the faculty who helped us put this presentation together. So Dr. Jeremiah Johnson in the Civil Engineering Department, who's my research advisor. Dr. Joe DeCarlos, who, as some of you may have heard, was nominated by President Biden to be the next administrator of the Energy Information Administration. And Dr. Jordan Cohn from the College of Natural Resources. And we also want to thank our friends in the Civil Engineering Department, Megan, Chian, Emily, and Ashley, for the valuable feedback they gave us on our slides. So thank you again, and we're happy to take any questions you guys have.
And actually, there's already a question in the chat about the CO2 equivalents for the production of electric versus gas versus diesel vehicles. And on a per car basis, electric cars generate more carbon to produce, but slightly more. I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head for you, but it is true that at the moment, gas and diesel cars can be produced on a per car basis with less total carbon emissions. However, very quickly in the lifetime of driving those cars, that emissions, because gasoline produces so many emissions per mile, is offset. And for more information, I'm actually going to point you to another YouTube video from Engineering Explained that talks about whether you should actually replace the car that you're driving or whether you should keep driving it or replace it with a more efficient or an electric car. And he does a pretty good job of explaining that nuance of this specific topic. But again, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it is true at the moment that production of a gas or diesel car is slightly more carbon intensive than slightly less carbon intensive than the production of an electric car.
One quick thing to add to that is also, in terms of electric vehicles, we're a little early on the learning curve of the technology, whereas gasoline cars, we're sort of towards the end because we've been using them for 100 years. In electric vehicles, we're trying to get there so you have very few manufacturers compared to how many manufacturers you have into gasoline. So we can expect that price to go down as we get ahead in the learning curve of the technology.
And we're happy to take questions on things that we talked about or things that we didn't talk about. Really, we have, like I said, a significant amount of time that we really want this to be kind of a talk that gets you thinking and then hopefully questioning some things. And if we can answer those, then we're happy to.
Okay, so we have a question on Duke's Renewable Energy Advantage program and if it actually replaces fossil fuels with renewables. I'm actually not aware of the Renewable Energy Advantage program.
If I'm remembering correctly, that's the program where customers can opt in and pay slightly more power to basically get their power coming from renewable energy, basically to support Duke's pursuit of renewable powers. And it looks like that is what it says. That's a pretty nuanced topic. So they are technically moving to renewables in some situations, but they're also still heavily reliant on natural gas, and they're planning on building more natural gas. How that money is actually used, I'm not familiar with, but it would have had to go through the North Carolina Utilities Commission for them to do something like this. So there should be some pretty clear legal documentation on what they're using that money for. I'm not particularly familiar with how it's broken down and itemized out, but I don't think that you're a sucker. I'm also signed up for it, so I think that they are required legally to use it for what they're saying they're using it for, but I'm not entirely sure how they go about that process.
One quick thing to add to that, I think the question in the parentheses is that shouldn't they be moving to renewables anyway? Yes, that's the short answer to that. And I'd point you to some of the documents that have been published in the public docket that researchers have filed. So Duke has proposed to build around 6 to 9 gigawatts of new natural gas capacity. And a lot of research has been done by folks at Cypress Creek Renewables and other organizations that looks at, and they justify this based on they're moving to a winter peaking system into the future. So to meet that winter peak demand when solar generation might not be available, they might need new natural gas capacity. And a lot of research has gone into that basically some of the assumptions they're using might not be right. So Duke is required to file something called an integrated resource plan every 2 years with the Public Service Commission, in which they have to show how they're going to meet future peak demand in various different scenarios. So I would point you to some of that research, which really looks at if Duke's assumptions are correct and if their proposed plan actually makes sense.
And then to answer the question on how we go from consumption of 36 quads to 13 of production, essentially, whenever we use thermal generation, so when we're burning things or using nuclear power, a lot of that, it generates a lot of heat, but we cannot get all of the heat out of that. And so we have to waste some of it. A lot of it goes into water bodies or goes through cooling towers, but essentially it's just we cannot extract all of the energy we get from burning things to actually generate electricity. So because of some, kind of nuanced thermodynamic laws, you can only get so much out of it. And so that's why we have to put 36 quads of energy into our electricity sector to get 13 usable quads out.
There's also another question on microgrids. So how can microgrids help improve the US electrical grid as a whole? I'm not sure I have a very direct answer to that, besides the fact that just the advantages provided by microgrids in terms of resiliency and reliability. In my opinion, I think it's both on the distributed energy side, resources side of like rooftop solar and demand response, and on the sort of transmission side, utility scale wind and solar, that's going to improve the U.S. grid as a whole. But that's not a anti-microgrid statement. I don't have the numbers or sort of a general feel for the topic to tell you.
And then on the question of whether smart grids will make use of renewable fuels, I guess when we say renewable fuels, are we talking about like biomass fuels and hydrogen, or are we talking about like renewable generation sources like solar and wind? In the U.S., biomass isn't extremely economically feasible because we use corn to generate a lot of biomass fuel, basically, and corn doesn't have a high energy density, but it's possible. Biomass is something that people have talked about using because it's technically, carbon neutral, because it gets the carbon from the atmosphere and then we burn it and put it back in the atmosphere. So technically a net of zero. Hydrogen is something that's really interesting, using hydrogen fuel cells. That's a very interesting technology that hasn't really been proven to scale up very well at this point in time, but it's definitely something that people are actively researching. And those innovations in those fields could really make it easier to decarbonize the grid in conjunction, because those would be more like a dispatchable resource like natural gas or something like that we have right now.
There's one more question on if the completely decarbonized grid would only be working on solar or renewable energy. Both. I would say. I wish I could predict that. We have really good modelers at NC State who are working on that research problem. But one thing on grid operation would be like having clean, firm resources that support solar and wind is essential. So you can think of nuclear, you can think of geothermal, which is a upcoming clean, sort of clean, firm baseline technology. So it could be a combination of nuclear, geothermal, demand side resources like demand response, energy efficiency. Um, so it could be a variety of things, not just solar and wind, but I think the dominant role would be played by utility scale solar and wind.
On the question regarding higher voltage for residential applications and whether it's reducing energy losses, um, on a technical basis, it probably is reducing energy losses. However, there would have to be some pretty substantial changes to like our electric codes and things like that to use higher voltage electricity for residential applications, mostly due to safety constraints. However, for the most part, you're gonna lose the bulk of your power over long distance transmissions. So if your lower voltages are for short distances, then it may end up being a negligible power loss for a specific line. And over the entire grid, it adds up for sure. But in terms of how much that's going to improve our losses on the grid, we transport power across the grid fairly efficiently. We don't lose a ton overall. So I'm not sure if that's a particular thing that could actually help as much as it would be the effort required to get it implemented in the U.S. And then on to the electric cars, how much will it increase the demand and how realistic is that to satisfy new and old demands? There have been several estimates on how much we'd actually increase demand by if we electrify stuff. From right now, if we think about we're using 13 quads of power and we want, of electrical power, and we want to replace that with the total consumption, 93. This isn't an exact, math, but that's a lot more electricity. So that's definitely a significant challenge, and that's what I was alluding to in the climate impacts, where I said that we're going to have some reduced capacity of existing infrastructure, and that could, it's going to require investments to build up our infrastructure systems, not only in terms of generation, but also in terms of transmission and moving things. So how realistic is it? It's definitely possible. The realistic is basically how much money gets put into it, into research now and into building things now, and preparing well. So it's not necessarily going to be an easy task, but I would say it's realistic.
Just one quick point I would add to that is on the research side, this also comes to like the legacy grid. So the grid on the transmission side, it's a mesh network. So if you want to get power from point A to point B and you can't, you can go to point C and then get it to point B. So you have a different route. Whereas on the distribution side, it's more of a radial network. So it wasn't really designed for two-way power flow. And this causes challenges in how you protect the equipment, sort of the voltage imbalances that happen on the distribution system. So these are really new challenges that are introduced by electrification. So, and you have really smart people, especially in the electrical engineering community. You have IEEE conference sessions that are dedicated to problems like this that are really evolving. So it's not just the demand, but how we protect the equipment on the grid and how we manage this reverse power flow on the distribution end with rooftop solar, with potentially if you're connected to some sort of demand response program with your EV. So these are new challenges that these laws introduce. But they're still worth doing. So,
right.
Yeah.
And then changes required to connect the different interconnects. Right now, I don't want to say the main reason that they're separate, but one of the distinguishing factors between them is that within one interconnect, they are all synchronized up. So the electricity grid runs at a certain frequency because we use AC power instead of DC power. So it has a frequency associated with it. In the US, everything is at 60 hertz. And so in the Eastern Connect and the Western Interconnect, they're going to be running at 60 hertz, but they may not be exactly synced. They may be out of phase. And so how power is transferred is it's converted to DC power and transferred over high voltage DC lines between them. So in terms of changes required to connect them, you'd have to work on getting everything synced up. Otherwise, you have to do some pretty serious synchronization when things move from one to the other. So it's not necessarily infeasible or impossible, but it would take some innovation in our grid and some investment in our grid now to connect everything in a more efficient manner. But that's one of the things that's probably going to happen as we introduce more renewable resources. And then, go ahead.
I had one quick point to add to that, because it's often, and this sort of ties into some of the other questions that have been asked as well, is that a very important piece of this, so what involves in requiring to connect different interconnections, is the policy side of things. Mm-hmm. So, things might be technically feasible. You might have the perfect technical solution, but if folks can't sort of translate and just that into a very succinct and coherent energy policy, it becomes very different. Like, so Lucas and I took an energy policy course with Dr. Christopher Galick last semester, and it really gives you a different perspective on how you think about the technical side of things and how you're trying to design an optimization problem, or how you're trying to design the most efficient energy storage system. But on the policy side of things, how you get that to actual deployment, there are many, many different hurdles involved. So there's the Public Service Commission, which is a whole another beast. So you have federal regulation and many different regulations. So the world of energy policy also comes into play in these decisions.
On the extracted minerals for batteries and electronic components, our best battery technology right now, are, as you probably know, are the lithium-ion batteries. The good news is that lithium is a pretty abundant element on the Earth, and it's not necessarily difficult to find. One thing that does go into these that is a pretty rare element that tends to be mined from other continents is cobalt. And there are significant efforts both from the academic and the research side, and also from the industry side, to remove cobalt from the actually building cars at all, so they're not relying on it. But right now, that's an example of an element that needs to be extracted and is more difficult to find and more scarce that our current electric vehicle technology is relying on. Anything else?
No, I think that's a good answer. I would also look up. I think there are folks at the Colorado School of Mines that are looking into those kind of problems. So there are a bunch of energy researchers who are specifically looking into mining and supply chain energy issues, with respect to the transition.
Yeah. Natural gas for winter heating and hot water. It is true that natural gas for a long time was a really efficient way to do your winter heat for your home and your hot water heating. And for a long time it was more efficient than electric. But recently, not even that recently, but in the last decade or so, there have been significant improvements in the energy efficiency of water heaters and space heaters, electric water heater and space heaters. So typically, right now, if you were to go buy a water heater or a space heater, and you were to buy one that's of average, not the best but not the worst either, it would most likely be better on CO2 and better on energy efficiency than a similar natural gas or a similar natural gas heater in the same price range. So it's a little bit of a nuanced problem, but at the moment there are plenty of efficient hot water and space heaters that are electric. The problem in that is that nobody's just replacing them when they feel like it. Nobody is sitting there one day and saying, "Hey, I want to replace my hot water heater." Like, it fails, and then you replace it. So the turnover on those is fairly low. So I think that probably answers that question.
There's one question. Are scientists also considering the influence of overpopulation? I'm not sure, but that the overpopulation being suggested as a sort of climate mitigation measure, or sort of mitigating, that gets into quite I would say, dark territories of different stuff. So, is that one of the methods? No, but I think resource management is, and predicting what resources we have based on the population trends is, yeah. I think that's
Yeah, I mean,
that's,
I think
all
as
I have.
engineers, we're trying to
Yeah.
meet the demands of our population in the best way we can. We're not trying to, determine how our population should grow or not grow. So I think that's probably the stance you'll find for most people working in this field. I can't speak for everybody, but that's certainly our stance.
Yeah.
Research into energy storage batteries that do not use rare metals, I can't say for certain. I'm not entirely sure, but I do know that you can pretty much get funding to research any kind of battery right now. So I'm sure there is research going into different types of batteries, especially ones that do not use rare metals. That sounds like something somebody would have talked about and came up with a project to explore. I'm just not familiar with that myself.
There are, I would look up folks in the chemical engineering department at NC State, because there are professors and researchers who are working on sort of different battery energy storage systems. These are great questions, guys, by the way. These are really good questions.
Are you familiar with the iron-air battery?
No.
Me neither.
No.
I'm sorry, I don't think we're familiar with the iron-air battery. But if you want to, you can send us an email and we will look into it and provide you our, I don't want to say best opinion, but that's effectively what you would probably get, an educated opinion.
One thing I will plug, especially for the students who are on the webinar, is NC State is a fantastic place to research on energy. Like, if you can pick any part of the energy system. So if you want to work on like batteries, if you want to work on the sort of core power system side, if you want to work on energy policy side, energy justice side, or you just want to work on climate communication, how do we better communicate these problems to the general public? You can basically research and work with excellent faculty in all of these different domains, spanning both engineering and non-engineering. So if you're considering energy is a great space to work in, and especially NC State is a good place to research in. And I promise I'm not getting paid to make that plug. So.
Me neither.
Okay, I think.
Yeah, I think one thing. Well, if anybody has any more questions, again, we'll hang out here for just a little bit, but it looks like the chat has stopped filling up with questions. So, again, we just want to thank you all for joining. Hopefully, you came away knowing more than you did when you came. If you want to ask more questions, if you have any more interesting things you want to discuss, or looking for opportunities for research, any kind of advice in that realm, feel free to contact Adi or I. We'll both be happy to talk and to help in any way we can. But if there's nothing else, then we'll let you get on with your day.
And also, one last thing, I want to plug the Student Energy Club. So if you're interested in joining the energy community on our campus, do check out ncsuenergyclub.org. We have a mentorship program, and we have many different events that we organize for the energy community on our campus. If you have a blog you want to write, or just connect with folks across campus, go to our website, and that should be a good place to check out what's going on our campus in terms of energy events. So, oh yeah, we have a question on the PowerPoint out. We will send out the PowerPoint to everyone after this webinar. Thanks, Emily.
And additionally, you should be able to find this webinar on YouTube sometime later this week, probably at the latest. We're going to leave it up. So if you want to go back or share it with somebody else, that's also fine.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.